I've been poring over Colonial Dutch records for a couple of decades now. Was thinking just this morning that the first time I came to visit the Sage Library, Dr. Beardsley sat down with me to have a conversation about my work. It was a wonderful help to me at that time. But I've been looking at the registrations of thousands of baptisms, professions of faith, and one question constantly in the back and often in the forefront of my mind has been, what did it mean for these people when they made the decision to join the church? To be honest, my quest to understand this remains a work in progress, and while I will offer some tentative thoughts on the subject today, I'm eager for the conversation that will follow to hear your thoughts and your speculation and learn about the subject and approaches that might be taken to get fuller answers. Obviously, for many, the decision to join the church came after serious soul-searching and prayer. And ironically, for others, the decision not to join the church was also a matter of religious scrupulosity. So I take it as a given. For many, probably most of these souls, the decision to join the church, to belong to the congregation, arose in good measure from a belief that they belonged, body and soul, in life and in death, to their faithful Savior, Jesus Christ. It is also true, however, that there were often, maybe almost always, other considerations which contributed to their decisions about whether, and if so, when, to join the church. I will start with a story from the early decades of European colonization in the mid-Atlantic, the mid-17th century, for which some of the details of the decision-making process is known from correspondence. Jeremias van Rensselaer, a young man, would become the third patroon of Rensselaerswijk and was a young man from a very wealthy and powerful Dutch family who was living in his family's patroonship in the Upper Hudson Valley. He regularly exchanged letters with his parents in the Netherlands, and one of the concerns his mother, Anna van Vellei, repeatedly raised in her letters to Jeremias was that he had not become a member of the church. She urged him to join. She even suggested that adversities he had experienced in business might be his own fault for not serving God, and reminded him that the fear of God is the beginning of all wisdom. When Jeremias became director of the patroonship, his mother thought it might be even more important that he join the congregation because he needed, quote, wisdom and good direction, or discretion. And he also needed to set a good example to those around him. A year after he took the director's seat, he wrote to his mother that he had finally become a church member. We only get a glimpse of what these two thought the pros and cons of church membership might have been, and yet it is an extremely well-documented case by comparison to what is known about the other 13 or 14,000 records of professions of faith that I have looked at. For better or worse, Anna van Vellei seems to have been suggesting that church membership brought with it wisdom and both spiritual and material blessings. She also evidently believed that it was the duty of a person of his stature to become a church member. And still, Jeremias hesitated. I can only offer three possible explanations for his hesitation. First, perhaps Jeremias lacked a personal interest in the church and hence in church membership. Second, Perhaps Jeremias saw some sort of high cost to church membership. Or third, perhaps Jeremias was one of the many throughout the history of Reformed churches who believed in God, but was unsure that they themselves were among the elect. So joining the church would put these people in the position of pretty much having to take communion, and in so doing, risk committing a grave sin. Jeremias was, in at least one sense, a member of the Dutch Reformed Church almost from birth. His baptism in Amsterdam as an infant conferred on him, as Daniel Meter has suggested, membership in Christendom or Christian civilization. Being a member of Christian civilization, especially in a colony which was in many ways an uncivilized and wild place, especially by European standards, was symbolically important. But being baptized as an infant was not a choice he made, and it brought little to him by way of burdens or privileges. Indeed, some who had been baptized as infants did not sit or lie under a sermon again until they wanted to be married or had to be buried. A second category of believer, short of full membership, was the liefhebber, literally one who loved, or a devotee. So in general, liefhebbers were people who attended church regularly and happily, but had not, for one reason or another, made the decision to join the congregation. Still, their names appear in many congregational documents, contributing to ministers' salaries or building campaigns, and they did not hesitate to air their feelings when disputes arose within or among the churches. Liefhebbers were, in a number of important respects, members of the Reformed community. The final category of belonging was members in full communion. And the question I have been pondering is, what tipped the balance for or against full church membership? Specifically, what were the pros and cons, or the benefits and costs they took into consideration, and how did that vary for various subsets of these communities? Again, I take it as a given that for many, the decision-making process started with self-reflection and prayer. But I don't think that anyone believed that formal church membership was necessary for salvation, even less so among people who were committed to the doctrines of irresistible grace and election. The most obvious of the things that likely kept some people from becoming church members was the prospect of the ordeal, in the old Germanic sense of the term, and probably in the contemporary sense of the word. That aspirants had to undergo this ordeal to become a member. I'm guessing this is familiar territory to most of you, but in practice, would-be church members had to present themselves to the teaching and ruling elders of their congregation or a subcommittee thereof for examination. They had to give evidence of their understanding of Reformed theology and of their own piety. The specific standards for this test varied widely over time and from congregation to congregation, but more on that later. It is easy to imagine people being reluctant to present themselves for such an examination, and also to imagine that it represented a higher bar for people of lower social status in the community. If the elders found the would-be members' profession of faith and outward piety to be satisfactory, membership was conferred. But this was not the end of the spiritual supervision these office holders and their successors were called upon to exercise. Excuse me. Members could expect occasional house visits, generally conducted by a minister and an elder. And this was often the source of anxiety for church members and their families. They expected, as one historian has described it, very personal and terse questions directed by the minister toward all members of the household. Church members were asked about irregularities in church attendance, failure to give adequate financial support to the church, and any personal behavior that might have been considered sinful. The minister also typically inquired into whether everyone in the home was engaging in daily Bible study and daily prayer, and with special reference to the young, the study of the catechism lessons. Another drawback some people may have seen in becoming members was that becoming a member meant consenting to be supervised by the consistory. It is remarkable how few limits there were to the aspects of members' lives the consistory could delve into. Colonial Reformed consistories had a well-developed theology of sin. And they also had a well-developed ecclesiology in terms of how the church should deal with that sin. Members were disciplined, of course, for matters directly related to the church. For instance, Henriques Dubois apparently took a different position in the Sidus Conferentii debate from his New Paltz consistory. The consistory found Dubois guilty of, quote, public disturbance, schism, and separatism, and also found him obstinate. And they censured him, barring him from communion, quote, until he shall have shown sincere repentance and regret to the congregation. Given the strength of feelings in that controversy, I don't think Dubois soon repented in a way that would satisfy the congregation or the consistory. Surviving consistory minutes for the 18th century are generally sparse, but if we widen our temporal gaze a bit, we see just how far consistories delved into the lives of members. Drunkenness was a common reason for censure and suspension. There is even an early 19th century case of excommunication for drunkenness. Theft, slander, forgery, dishonesty, domestic violence, and other forms of intentional injury were causes for consistorial discipline as well. Indeed, at one consistory meeting, 4 individuals, 2 married couples, were suspended for the table for 6 to 9 months for some household quarrels. Becoming a full member of a Reformed congregation also meant accepting responsibilities. Even for a man as wealthy and powerful as Jeremias, perhaps especially for a man as wealthy and powerful as Jeremias, it is easy to imagine a range of reasons to be hesitant to take that step. As a baptized member or a leafheber in the congregation, the consistory would have little authority over him. He could not be called to answer for spotty church attendance or failure to support his church financially, or for failure to raise his children in the fear and understanding of the Lord, for house quarrels, for behavior that fell outside the norms of the community. So the question remains then, what was in it for Jeremias? If he were a rational business person calculating the advantages and costs of joining the church, what would he have put on the credit side of the ledger? Laying aside the words of his mother, whose admonitions implied that there was material benefit in this life to church membership, one must assume that taking communion was an important, if not the most important, reason to join the church. Whatever Jeremias' theology of the sacraments, being admitted to the table was the most concrete advantage to full membership. And the ability to rescind that privilege was the main instrument the consistory had in discipline. I think we can also see in the timeline of Jeremias' life hints that becoming a full member had something to do with one's standing in the community. Jeremias joined the church at about the same time he took the patroon's seat, and implicit in his family's urgings was the idea that becoming a full member is what proper or prominent people did. Certainly there must have been some socio-psychological pressure to be among the inner circle of the congregation on Communion Sunday. Or to put it in the negative, there must have been some desire not to be among the people who had to abstain from the elements as the full members of the congregation were served. There were other advantages. I was back a slide, sorry. There were other advantages to church membership as well. Some congregations required that either the bride or the groom had to be a member for the marriage banns to be published. Though there are numerous examples of husbands and wives joining congregations together, so that was not the case at all times and in all places. It was also pretty common to require that one of the parents be a member in order to present a child for baptism, though there was always an alternative. Commonly, for instance, if a member in good standing were willing to stand as a witness for the parents, that was enough. And of course, for males who aspired to serve as elders or deacons in the church, being a member in good standing was the most basic of requirements. Nevertheless, there were a lot of people who faced the decision of when or whether to join a colonial Dutch Reformed church whose life experiences were very different from Jeremias's. And I would like to spend the rest of my time talking about what church membership might have meant to 4 categories of these people. First, Jeremias joined the church when New Netherland was still New Netherland, before the English conquest of 1664. Thus, when Jeremias became a member, the Dutch Reformed Church had an enforced monopoly on public worship. After 1664, the Dutch Church was still in a strong and prominent position in what were now English colonies, but it had competition, ever-growing competition. And this had at least 2 implications for individuals considering whether or when to join a Dutch Reformed congregation. I have written and spoken a little elsewhere about the first, so I will only mention it briefly today. But as a protected Dutch institution in an English colony, the church came to have a strong cultural, linguistic, and ethnic component to it. So suffice it to say here that for some, belonging to the Dutch church was connected to Dutch identity in an English colony. Less often noticed is what church membership meant with respect to the social safety net. Before the English conquest, Reformed congregations played an essential role caring for widows, orphans, the sick, disabled, and those who were poor for other reasons. And the role at that point extended, it seems, to just about any nominally Christian person in the general neighborhood of the church. In the decades after 1664, as the variety and numbers of churches in the region increased, congregations no longer saw their duty as extending to the poor of the broader community, but rather to the poor of their own congregation. Already in 1689, for example, the consistory of Kingston decided that henceforth it would only support the Dutch Reformed poor. The consistory did not make it clear whether it was enough to be a liefhebber or if full membership was required. But it seems safe to say that the closer one's attachment to the church, the better one's odds were to receive help from the church in times of need. In a sense, becoming a church member meant an increased level of security that one's needs would be met if one's life took a downward turn. A second category of people in the Dutch Reformed Church whose life experiences would have been very different from Jeremias were African Americans. To be sure, many of the foregoing considerations would have held true in much the same way for African Americans as they did for those of European descent. But the experiences of African Americans living in colonial communities undoubtedly shaped the way they viewed official recognition of membership in the inner circle of the congregation. Life experiences must also have had some bearing on the value they placed on the prospect of poor relief. And as many African Americans spent their entire lives serving in and around Dutch households, even some linguistic and cultural aspects of the Dutch church might have made belonging attractive. The supervisory role of the consistory may well have cut both ways, however, especially for slaves. On the one hand, submitting to the ordeal of the initial examination and then to ongoing supervision by the European American men of the consistory might well have been more daunting for an African American than it had been for Jeremias. On the other hand, consistories were also, in a sense, courts. Masters could and did refer slaves who were church members to the consistory, at least in the early Republic. Slaves found guilty of sin by the consistory were censured or suspended. If this was the only punishment the slave received for the sin, it would seem to me personally better than punishments that the law allowed masters to mete out. But getting beyond this type of analysis is difficult because of the limits of surviving records. We know that a sizable number of people of African descent were baptized and married in the Reformed Church before the English conquest. Records regarding church membership for that period are, however, almost non-existent for people of any ethnicity or race. Then, from the late 1600s to the late 1700s, African Americans appear to have almost vanished from the colonial Reformed Church records. I see three possible explanations for this. The first theory is that African Americans vanished from the records because they left or were driven out of the churches. To the extent that I accept this view, I am not at all alone among scholars. I am alone, however, in the second and third theories, which are that African Americans remained in the churches but were either omitted from the records or became camouflaged in the records. I suspect it was a combination of all three. To begin to understand why African Americans appeared in the records, then almost disappeared for about a century, and then reappeared, I think three sets of historical context are useful. Very briefly, the first concerns events and patterns in the region in general. At about the time of the near disappearance, there was widespread concern among slaveholders that should their slaves become free, or their slaves become Christians, their slaves would have to be freed. This does nothing to explain why free people would have disappeared from the records, however. And colonial legislatures in New York and New Jersey acted to reassure slaveholders on this count in 1704 and 1706. It is also true that the demographics of the slave population were changing in terms of the numbers and origin of human property being imported, and that may not have favored participation in Dutch churches. Though again, this does not speak directly to the free people. Finally, it may well be, as historian Andrea Musterman has argued, that in those colonial communities where whites depended increasingly upon slave labor, that those whites also became increasingly hostile toward sharing their churches with African Americans. On the other end of the period, at about the time African Americans began to reappear in the records, or a little later, religious currents in the United States were bringing new interest among Europeans to proselytizing African Americans. Indeed, something like a competition arose among some denominations. A second context to understand this involves the policies and interests of the colonial Dutch church. And I'm going to oversimplify horribly here, but between the time that ministers were teaching African Americans about the Reformed faith in the 17th century and the imperfect statements affirming the rights of African Americans to join the Reformed Church in America, in the Reformed Church by the new American denomination in 1788 and 1792, there is silence in the records. Nothing which suggests to me new attitudes or policies sufficient to drive African Americans, slave and free, out of the churches so rapidly and permanently. The third important context in which to view the near disappearance from the records is that of the Reformed Church record keeping. I will just offer a few ideas now. First, it became increasingly common in this period for congregations to require a fee to register a baptism or a marriage. The ceremonies were free, but the inscribing, the writing of them, entailed a fee. And I can easily imagine that for slave children, this was an obstacle. Second, I believe it became increasingly common for African Americans to be recorded not just with a first name, but with a family name as well. And without reference to the race of the people baptized, married, or joining the church, that made them hard to identify, that makes them hard to identify in the records now. Third, and finally, African Americans started showing up again in the records not only at the time when there was an increased interest in proselytizing them, but also at the moment when, after Reformed Church classes and synods began functioning in North America, the records were being kept much more faithfully. Here is a case of one registration that strikes me as very probably the baptism of an African American. I've been interested in this Schenectady family